Please welcome Elina and Robin.
And Robin, I'll share the screen and we can start.
Great, thanks, Elina. So thank you to Maria and Dan. We're very happy to be here and happy to give this presentation. We hope that everyone learns a lot, and feel free if you have questions to ask whenever you'd like. Elina, I think we see your presenter screen, not the other screen. So just swap the display here.
It's interesting we tested, didn't it work?
Yeah, I saw. So this is a project on flexibility auctions, and it is the goal is a framework for managing imbalance risk. As Maria mentioned, my name is Robin Hytowitz, and along with the PI of our project, Elina Spyrou, will present today. There are quite a few other groups and companies, and you can see our fellow collaborators listed from Johns Hopkins University, from Packetized Energy, and then also from Kilowatt Hour Analytics, who are joining the project this year. So we're thankful to their input as well. And I guess a note of interest that Elina and I, yes, we met when we were at Hopkins and we were office mates. And so it's a pleasure to have a continued collaboration, especially on such a great project. So on the next slide, you'll see a little bit of background on the funding for this project. We are part of the ARPA-E Perform project, which is, again, a Department of Energy ARPA-E funded project. There are 12 different teams, and folks on the line might be familiar with the project already. I think Maria is involved in one of them. And as you can see, there's also data teams that are involved that are producing data sets that will eventually be crafted and organized in public. And so we encourage everyone, we're happy to send out links to some of the data that's being used in this project as well, since it's really quite a colossal effort. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, Perform, the aim is risk-aware grid management. So there's many ways that we can do that, and a lot of the teams are exploring different aspects that are listed here in addition to others. And so that's the kind of overall goal of our project, and we'll get into a lot of details on the specific risks we're looking at and why we think we need to look at it. So on the next slide, you'll see our basic agenda, 4 main parts. First, we'll give a broad introduction, talk a little bit about electricity markets and why we think we need this flexibility auction. Then we'll get into the details of the auction itself, its design, and how the settlements will work. A couple of very brief examples, and then our next steps, which will include internships. So if there are folks who are looking for internships, both NREL and EPRI do hire, and so as EPRI does hire during the year as well, so please get in touch. And so on the next slide, we have a few slides that are a very broad overview of electricity markets themselves, just to level set to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Some people will be more intimately familiar with these than others, but we figured we will level set and get into that brief introduction. So if you go to the next slide, you can see we're talking about independent system operators. This is a very broad map. You can see where they are in the US, and their main goal is their main purpose. They're independent, they're nonprofit organizations, and they operate the transmission system reliably in a just and reasonable manner. So that's the 1-sentence overview of their role in our markets. And again, you can see there are quite a few in the US and Canada, 9 in total. And with the figure on the far left of California, this is includes their 5-minute market, participants in their 5-minute market. And then on the right, you can see one of the operators in the middle of the country called SPP also has incoming imbalance market. And so it's really a wide swath of the country that is under some kind of operating market. And now the Southeast, there's the beginnings of a market that's not quite operational yet, although it'll likely look different than the rest. So on the next slide, again, we have kind of an overview to look at the fuel mix in all these different regions. Again, here are the 9 current ISOs and RTOs in the US and Canada. And you can see that the energy production, again, this is a couple of years old from 2018, across those different regions can look pretty different. So some are more coal heavy, some have almost no coal, almost all have a pretty large percentage of natural gas use. But the main purpose here is to show that there's, while there are a few dominant colors, the rainbow is coming out in some areas, for instance, in California. So you can see that solar and wind are becoming more prominent there. And so right now we're looking at trying to model for uncertain resources. And so while that might not be a huge percentage of everyone's energy production right now, we certainly expect that to grow. I'll talk about that in a couple slides. Yeah, so here we have, again, the basic functionality, just again, to give the very broad overview of electricity markets. There's markets that span years, go to, minutes, and then what happens after. So kind of in the years out time frame, 20 years out, we will have long-term power purchase agreements. And so that's not something that the ISOs or RTOs are involved with. That's between two individual players, sellers and buyers, or producers and consumers. But then coming into the kind of closer year out, 3 years, and then actually if you click one more, we also have the annual or seasonal market or capacity markets. And capacity markets are present at some of the ISOs and not all, but these are ways for generators with kind of steel in the ground to enable them to pay their upfront costs going forward, and also to incentivize new capacity. And so again, not all markets have these, and there's a lot of details that we will not be talking about today, but just to give you a sense of what the ISOs do, this is one market that they're part of. And then moving forward in time, we kind of come down to both the Dayahead, and then if we go one more, the real-time markets. And these are for energy and ancillary services. And we won't get into the details of the distinctions here, but you'll get a sense for that. And lastly, when we go months out, we might have price corrections and settlement procedures, again, depending on the outcomes of the Dayahead and real-time market, or sorry, months after. And so our focus in this presentation on our work is in this Dayahead and real-time market timeframe. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And so here again, very broad and not nearly as detailed as it could be overview of the Dayahead and real-time markets. And so you can see the two orange boxes, the Dayahead market, which includes unit commitments, essentially committing units for the next day, and our real-time market, which schedules units, the dispatch schedule for the units, what level they should be at. And so you can see, if we again start on the far left, we have different inputs into our Dayahead market. That includes ancillary service requirements, demand bids, variable energy resource bids, generator bids, and information. So it's a great deal of information kind of from the outset from all of the different resources who are participating. And then on the bottom box, you can see the transmission network, facilities, outages, and contingencies are also included. So there's a lot of broad information that goes into this Dayahead market and unit commitment. It's optimized, and out of that comes market clearing prices, commitment schedules, and dispatch schedules. Then as we move forward in time, there's a lot of processes that happen in between these two, for instance, reliability unit commitment, but we won't be getting into that today. But as we move forward, there's more information that's then added to the real-time market. That's any kind of updated load forecast, updated renewable forecast, and then including then some of the information that was either cleared from the Dayahead market or bid into the Dayahead market, such as ancillary service requirements and some of the generator bids, including renewable bids that can be then put into the real-time market, out of which comes our market clearing prices and our updated dispatch schedules. And again, I know this is a lot of information very quickly. Some of you are going to be intimately familiar with, and others, maybe it's a little newer. So hopefully this very broad overview can give you a sense of how markets operate today. And again, a very simplistic view. And so if we move one forward, you'll see what we're talking about today is, or what we're focusing on, is the net load imbalance. And so that is the difference between the Dayahead and real-time forecasts. So as you had seen, there's input to the Dayahead market, including forecasts. And then in the real-time market, there's also forecasts being included. And so what we're focusing on is that the Dayahead market typically clears between 13 and say about over 30 hours ahead of actual operation. And so the information you have 30 hours out is going to be much different than the information you have an hour out of operation. And so the difference between the forecast, both in load and renewables that we have for that, is what we're focusing on, and because there's a great deal of uncertainty there. So if we move forward one, that uncertainty, that imbalance risk, that imbalance comes with some risk. So what happens if we're not properly hedged for those imbalances? So there's many options, but two main ones that we can think about. First, if we don't have enough resources that are committed, we might have high prices or even load shedding, right? So if we end up having less renewables than we thought we were, we might not have enough units online that can ramp up in time, or we might have to turn on a very expensive unit. And so those might be with might occur if there's an imbalance where there's not enough. But the reverse can also happen. If you think you're going to have a very low amount of renewables, for instance, and you end up with a great amount, you might have over procured in your day ahead market for real time. And so over procuring can come with several impacts. One of them, of course, is cost. You might increase your costs unnecessarily. And another is you might actually not be able to operate very flexibly in real time. Generators have a minimum operating level, and if you are not able to ramp them down enough, you might not actually have the flexibility to turn them off in time. So there still might be consequences for load. So essentially, this is, again, the broad overview of where the risk is that we're mainly focused on. And so on the next slide, you'll see another big motivator. So now let's get into kind of some of the core of what we're looking at specifically. I know this is not a surprise to anyone that we expect an increase of renewables worldwide. So the International Energy Agency had predicted that by 2050, almost 70% of electric generation will be from wind and solar. So it's pretty significant. Again, you can think back to those figures, the bar charts that we showed of energy generation, and 70% was none of the ISOs, unless, none of the ISOs currently have 70% from wind and solar. And so that requires both system operators and flexible resources to help manage this imbalance challenge. So let's look at what the imbalance looks like today. And you can see in the bottom figure, this is the net load imbalance that I described the definition on the last slide between the 15-minute market and the day ahead market. Now, California is a little unique in that they have two near real-time markets, but for now we can call this real-time market number one between the 15-minute market and the day ahead market. And you can see we are showing the 97.5 percentile and the 2.5 percentile over a couple of years, a couple of the last few years. And up is nearly 3,000 megawatts and down is nearly 2,000 megawatts. So that's essentially if you had thought you were going to have a nuclear unit online and it all of a sudden wasn't online. Or it can be similarly if you thought, for instance, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District in California, all of their loads suddenly dropped offline. So it's a pretty significant imbalance that operators and all participants will have to manage. So if we go to the next slide, we essentially come up with three hypotheses of why we need this flexibility option based on some of the information that you just heard. And so we'll get into the details of the auction, but again, these are the three hypotheses we have. One is that there is a need and availability for operational flexibility, and that depends on the day ahead schedule. So what you do in day ahead is going to impact what's available in real time. We also will caveat that there are some regions where that might be a little less true, where they're a little less dependent on the day ahead schedules, for instance, in Texas, but we think this is broadly probably likely true. On the next one, we have the expected deployment cost of flexibility can't be ignored. Resources with uncertain output need access to hedges. So again, that's something that we had discussed with the imbalance risk, where the cost of imbalance can be high. And so we can't ignore that cost, and we need to make sure that resources have the ability to hedge that additional cost. And lastly, proactive scheduling of flexibility and forward payments could yield less steep real-time supply curves, which would lower balancing costs. And so that's another piece of that puzzle. So if we are doing things proactively and we have things scheduled appropriately, we might be able to further lower costs. So again, so here, based on everything you've heard so far, we have these three hypotheses, and now we'll start to move, I think, into the auction on the next slide. Oh, sorry, a little preview before we move into the auction. So we have our basic motivation, as I alluded to before, system operators and flexible resources must manage or hedge challenges from day ahead to real-time imbalances. So that's the broad motivation we've been discussing. And here's a preview of everything going on, and you'll see some figures, and we'll get into what all those mean. So for participants, we have two sides of our auction. We have sellers and buyers. sellers who have flexibility, and buyers who have uncertainty in their output. We then have offers for our buyers, and we are allowing them to submit a form of probabilistic offer into the market, and Elina will get into a lot more detail there. Then the product itself, it's an option product, and we'll get into how that can be exercised. And finally, we have our settlements, which we have Dayahead and real-time settlements based on how the option is exercised. And so we'll get into some of those details. And so now we can move on. So now that you had the broad overview, and talk about all of the details.
Thanks, Robin. And we will now talk about the design of the flexibility auction, which will cover both the participants, the offers from buyers of flexibility options, and also we will cover examples later. And then Robin will talk about the settlements. So by now, we all know that this project is about imbalance risk. So we are proposing a flexibility auction that will procure flexibility in order to hedge uncertainty. And the idea is that this flexibility auction will identify cost-effective hedging of energy imbalances. And the product we are trading and the product we are proposing is called flexibility options. So on one side, we have the buyers of flexibility options. And you can imagine as buyers, any participants who can describe their output with a probabilistic forecast. And this could be solar power plants, wind power plants, or load-serving entities. So they specify a need for flexibility and willingness to pay by submitting this probabilistic forecast. So they submit the generation or consumption for their participant at a specific percentile and time interval. And they can also submit their willingness to pay for hedging the generation shortfalls. And then the ISO is really the entity that defines the set of percentiles and the respective probability of shortfall. With an example that we will see, all this notation will hopefully become more clear. But before seeing the example, let's make sure we're on the same page on what the probabilistic forecast is. So traditionally in electricity markets, we had a deterministic forecast, and this deterministic forecast was either the median or the expected value. And if the forecast was symmetric, the two coincided. So here, for example, it could be the orange line we are seeing in this graph. So we would have a time series for the wind power over the entire day. However, now with new methods on probabilistic forecasting, and some of them are relying on ensembles of numerical weather prediction models and quantile regression, or even machine learning, we have more percentiles than the median. So here, for example, you can see the fifth percentile is the line at the bottom of this graph. And what the fifth percentile means is that 95% of the time, the wind power that we are actually seeing should be higher than this fifth percentile if the probabilistic forecast is well calibrated. So in our project, we basically assume that the buyers of flexibility options have access to probabilistic forecast. And you can see the probabilistic forecast here with the blue markers. And this probabilistic forecast came from a data team. As Robin mentioned, there is one data team that works on generating probabilistic forecasts for ERCOT, SPP, and I think New York ISO. And they provide 99 percentiles for every hour of the day in 2018. So here we see the probabilistic forecast day ahead for just 1 hour for the entire ERCOT system. So the buyer of the flexibility option here, like the wind generation, has access to this probabilistic forecast, the blue points. The ISO is the one who chooses which percentiles the participant can submit. Because of computational complexity, not all 99 percentiles will be communicated to the ISO, and also some of them are so close to each other in terms of megawatt hours that it wouldn't make a big difference even if we knew all the information. So in our first set of simulations, we just visually basically did a back of the envelope analysis and decided to go with 9 percentiles, the 5th, the 10th, the 20th, and so on. So the buyer of the flexibility options, let's assume that the wind generation wants to hedge their output. They have to submit these percentiles. So they have to submit their corresponding generation at the 9 percentiles. And then we'll see how the flexibility options work. So let's assume here that the day-ahead energy schedule is at the 10th percentile. There is still a possibility that 5% of the time the wind generation will need upward flexibility to counter an imbalance between these 2 points. So this, we call it tier 1, and we consider it in the flexibility auction with a probability. For the time being, we consider it with the difference between the two percentiles, but eventually we will have a discrete approximation of the continuous probabilistic forecast with these set points. Then if the day-ahead energy schedule is at the 20th percentile, then you can imagine that more flexibility will be needed and at higher frequency. So the difference now between this 20th and the 10th percentile is the tier 2 upward flexibility that this wind generation would need. And again, it's being considered with a probability of deployment higher than the tier 1. So following this logic, we can go all the way up to the 9th percentile, and this is how we're getting 8 tiers for upward flexibility. And the same logic applies for the downward flexibility. So if the day-ahead energy schedule, for example, is at the 90th percentile, then for 5% of the time, we might need to go higher. So we would procure tier 8 downward flexibility. We would need another generator to ramp down in order for us to sell this additional energy we have. And the probabilities look symmetric with the tiers of the upward direction. So overall, this brings us back to the first hypothesis for the need for such an auction. And the hypothesis 1 assume that the need for operational flexibility depends on the day-ahead energy schedule. So for example, if our day-ahead energy schedule was at the 50th percentile, and we wanted to hedge this wind output, we would need to buy 4 tiers in the upward direction and 4 tiers in the downward direction. If on the other hand, our day-ahead energy schedule was at the 20th percentile, we would need to buy 2 tiers in the upward direction and 6 tiers in the downward direction. So you can hopefully see that the need for operational flexibility depends on the day-ahead energy schedules. And also we are talking about high probabilities. So the deployment costs for this flexibility cannot be ignored because we are not talking about a risk that rarely happens and we just want to be hedged, but we don't care about the deployment cost. In this case, some tiers have very high probability, so it's good to know how much it will cost us to deploy this flexibility. And resources with uncertain output would need access to hedges. Now that we have looked into the buyers, looking on the right-hand side of this slide, we can discuss the sellers of flexibility options. So sellers of flexibility options can be any participants that they can control their output to either ramp up or ramp down from the day-ahead energy schedule to counter the imbalances. And the sellers of flexibility options, they specify a strike price at which they're willing to provide the flexibility. So in the upward direction, they essentially provide a strike price at which they would supply real-time energy. In the downward direction, they specify a strike price at which they would buy real-time energy. So here is another simple motivating example that shows on the left-hand side a unit that can only be committed day ahead, and on the right-hand side a unit that can be committed only in real time. The difference between the two comes to the flexibility up and flexibility down strike price. The unit that can be committed day ahead, it has a mean-gen level, but at the same time, it has lower cost for deploying flexibility, while the unit that can be committed in real time has higher cost. So this motivating example shows our other hypothesis that the availability of operational flexibility depends on the day-ahead energy schedule. In particular, if we don't commit this unit on the left day ahead, we don't have access to its flexibility in real time. So it's easy to imagine cases where that could happen in the market and certain units were not committed, so they're not available in real time to counter imbalances. Moreover, the proactive scheduling of flexibility could also yield less steep real-time supply curves. So the real-time supply curve is less steep for the unit on the left-hand side compared to the unit on the right-hand side. And that's a hypothesis that if we start considering the imbalances in the day ahead, then we would be able to see through the day-ahead optimization problem the trade-off between committing certain units that could provide flexibility to counter imbalance later. And before we go into the settlements, we have here a slide on the operator's perspective. And this is really important because we propose this flexibility auction to be essentially co-optimized within the day-ahead electricity market. And the reason for that is that the flexibility is conditional on the day-ahead schedule. And the role of the ISO is essentially to take inputs that describe the need for flexibility and willingness to pay, and the cost of flexibility and capabilities, and it provides us outputs, flexibility option awards, and flexibility prices. And after everything has been run, and after the actual time, a few days later, the system operator does the settlement of flexibility options. And now, back to Robin to talk about the settlements.
Thanks, Elina. So we'll, again, briefly talk about the settlements for the different elements. And then we have, after that, an example, a kind of a decision tree, so that maybe aspects of this will be clearer if it's not. So on the next slide, you can see that we'll start with the day-ahead settlements. And so we haven't shown the full formulation, and if anyone is curious, we're happy to discuss with them the formulation. So don't get too bogged down in the notation here, since we haven't fully defined it. But essentially, they're the two constraints that match the hedges from supply and demand up and the hedges from supply and demand down. The shadow price from those two constraints are our flexibility price up and flexibility price down. So again, this is not too dissimilar from taking the node balance constraint for energy and then taking the shadow price of that to be the price for energy. And so then kind of moving over, on the top, we have buyers for flex up and flex down. On the bottom, we have sellers for flex up and flex down. And so for the buyers, the amount that they're going to pay is the flex up price, again, the shadow price, or the flex down price, depending if it's up or down, less the probability weighted average strike price. And so this, you can see our little note, this is the megawatt weighted average over all of the suppliers who are chosen in the auction. And of course, times their quantity. And then you can see for the sellers, they will be receiving the flex price up or down, less their own probability weighted strike price. And so rather than the megawatt averaged over all of them, it's their own. Moving on to, I think the next slide should be the real-time settlements. And so this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. And so we'll have the day-ahead energy award and the real-time physical availability. And so now we have three different cases. And that deals with which option can the buyer exercise, and then what is the spread they receive. So If they have a negative imbalance, meaning their day-ahead award was higher than their real-time award, they can use their up option. And then they'll have the spread of the max of 0 or the real-time price less their strike price. Then if they have a positive imbalance on the other side, meaning their day-ahead award was less than their real-time physical availability, they'll be able to use their downward option. And similarly, they'll have the max of 0 or the strike price less the real-time price. And finally, if there is no imbalance, meaning what they predicted day ahead is what they are producing in real time, then they don't exercise the option. So you can see the option is exercised based on their real-time physical availability compared to their day-ahead energy award. And so this is the buyer's perspective in real time, moving on to the seller's perspective. Yeah. And so this, again, based on their day-ahead energy award, they are responding to real-time flexibility. So it's not based on their output real-time, since they're responding to the flexibility needs. So what happens? In the first case, we have a system-wide negative imbalance. And so again, because it's not due to the, we're not matching individual suppliers with individual buyers, we're matching the system-wide need. So if there is a system-wide negative imbalance, then they will be using their upward awards, and the supplier pays in real time the max of 0 or the real-time price minus their own strike price. However, if there's a system-wide positive imbalance, you might have guessed they'll use their downward hedge, and then they'll receive the max of the 0 or their own strike price less the real-time price. And lastly, if there's no imbalance, then we have the case where there's no price spread because there is not an imbalance that's causing the need for them to exercise any of the flexibility options. And so again, here's the basics of the settlement. We have different cases in each, and maybe the example I think we have coming up next, if it's not clear, will help explain how the options can be exercised, which I think should be next. Yeah.
Thank you. So now we will go through one simple example. In this simple example, we have a wind power plant. And in this case, we are not looking at 99 percentiles. We are looking at 2 scenarios with equal probabilities. Let's assume that this wind power plant in Dayahead, they know that their physical availability in real time will either be 80 megawatt or 100 megawatt for a specific hour. And let's further assume that in Dayahead, the market cleared and it provided an energy award for this wind power plant, 100 megawatt at a specific hour. So we are talking about megawatt hours essentially. And we will see a simple decision tree. So the common notation applies. We have square for decision nodes and circles for chance nodes. And then we have with triangles the outcomes. So the wind power plant essentially faces a choice between buying a flexibility up option or don't buying a flexibility up option. And we saw this case because we're also proposing this flexibility option as a voluntary market. So even if an ISO adopts this proposal, it will be a voluntary market. So if we follow the bottom branch of this decision tree and we haven't bought the flexibility up option, we are waiting for the chance node in the real time to reveal to us if we have 80 megawatt or 100 megawatt. And in case we have 80 megawatt, we will resolve this imbalance in real-time market. So this is how it also happens today. We would essentially buy this 20 megawatt hours of deficit at the real-time energy price. Now, if we have bought the flexibility up option, again, we are waiting to see if we will have 80 megawatt or 100 megawatt physical availability. If we have 100 megawatt physical availability, it's the case from the settlement slides that we cannot exercise the option because we don't have any real-time imbalance, so nothing changes for us. If, on the other hand, our real-time physical availability is 80 megawatt, we can exercise the option. And here we have an extra layer of uncertainty that has to do with the real-time price, because we only have an incentive to exercise the option only if the real-time price is higher than the option strike price. If the real-time price is lower than the option strike price, the imbalance would be resolved in the real-time market. So this is a simple example for one generator, but in our project, we really want to estimate the impact of the proposed modification on system cost and reliability and participants to basically be able to address any questions power system operators will have before adopting this modification. So we are doing a classic counterfactual analysis where we are doing simulations with the flexibility auction, as you see on the left, and simulations with the business as usual case on the right. The simulations with the flexibility auction have probabilistic forecasts. The business as usual have deterministic forecasts. And the simulations with the flexibility auction, of course, have the formulation of the auction and the flexibility awards. So we are doing these simulations in Festive. I will not go through this figure in detail, but I just wanted to show that we are trying to follow the setup of the markets as closely as possible. So we have a day-ahead unit commitment that informs a real-time unit commitment, which we run 96 times within a day. And then the real-time unit commitment informs a real-time economic dispatch that runs 280 times per day. And for that, we're using a model called Festive. And using this model, we have starting to obtain preliminary results on the value of the flexibility auction. So let's explain what we're seeing here. So the purple shaded area in the graph is the range of the day-ahead net load forecast. So the y equals 0 line is essentially the case where the real-time net load corresponds to the median day-ahead forecast, and you are seeing the range from the median in the upward direction and in the downward direction. So this is a day that it has quite a bit of uncertainty. You can see that the range goes all the way higher than 5 gigawatt or lower than 5 gigawatt. So we might need 10 gigawatt flexibility up and down. So this number comes from the data team, so they might be further revised. What is important to note here is the orange line, which is the real-time net load. And here, the 26th of March 2018, as the data looks now, seems to be a day that the real-time net load was higher than the median. So we would need a lot of upward flexibility. And this is essentially a day that we see our proactiveness in scheduling flexibility paying off. Essentially, the flexibility app we committed in Dayahead, it seems that is being used for most of the time in the real-time market. And you can see here we say that the business as usual has higher cost than the flexibility auction. So that's a win day for the flexibility auction. On the other hand, this day, the 22nd of October, again, it has much more uncertainty, which is something that the data teams are investigating. When you see this range going in the upward direction all the way 10 gigawatt and the downward 10 gigawatt more. But what we're seeing is that the real-time net load is actually very close to the median. And some hours, like hour 4 and all the way up to hour 9, they require a little bit of upward flexibility. But like later in the day, we also require downward flexibility. We have scheduled the median. And this seems to be a day in the current formulation that wasn't a win for our flexibility auction. The business as usual case had lower costs, and this is something we're investigating. And we are basically seeing that when we are procuring flexibility for a wide range of outcomes, maybe we are over procuring flexibility, so we have extra costs to commit this flexibility, and if the real-time net loads ends up being closer to the median, we actually never get to use this flexibility. The other observation we have, and the design question we want to address in this quarter, is that the downward direction, we haven't considered flexibility from units that can be decommitted in the real time. This is consistent with some designs that the system operator have, but it seems that in our synthetic case, it can make a difference because the business as usual case can decommit units between the Dayahead and the real time, but the flexibility auction hasn't considered this flexibility counting towards the flexibility downwards. So results like the ones we're seeing here will come from our project in the coming months. And here we are basically going to address the next step. So one next step we have is to do a comparison, not only qualitatively, but also via simulations or analytical examples of how the flexibility options compare to existing market products. And we have identified 3 products: the flexibility ramping product, the virtual bidding, and the imbalance reserve product. So all these products share some similarities with the flexibility options. For example, the ramping product attempts to price flexibility. The virtual bidding hedges the head to real-time prices, and it does arbitrage between the head and real-time prices. And the imbalance reserve product is currently proposed at the California ISO, and it explicitly considers the net load uncertainty between the day-ahead and the real-time. So the flexibility auction is different because the buyers of the flexibility options can determine their flexibility needs through submission of probabilistic forecast. And that's a difference with the imbalance reserve product, where the requirement is set by the ISO. The buyers can also incur costs for the additional flexibility they require. That's also a difference to be determined because the cost allocation for the imbalance reserve product is under discussion. Also, the sellers receive upfront payments in the head, and these payments not only include the opportunity costs. And the system operator also considers the cost for flexibility deployment to decide on the flexibility awards. So you can imagine that we'll have a third set of simulations where we model this imbalance reserve product in particular. So the simulations will more clearly show the differences in the cost and the pricing and the awards between the imbalance reserve product and the flexibility auction. So in terms of next steps, we are doing a lot of simulations with updated assumptions on the technical operational flexibility. We have observed that the technical operational flexibility differs from flexibility implied by cost curves. The quality of the forecast is also important. And our project has a second part that looks into the aggregators providing flexibility. We didn't talk about it today, but that's also a focus area for the project. And lastly, we want to analyze correlations to assess if we need an aggregator of uncertain participants, if it makes sense for buyers of flexibility options not to participate individually, but to participate through an aggregator. So with that, I would really like to thank you for the invitation. I really like to thank you for the participation, the attention. We're looking forward to questions, feedback you have. If you are interested in the auction, in internships, in even jobs at NREL or EPRI, please get in touch with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elina and Robin. Truly enjoyed it. We have something like 10 minutes to go through some questions. I see Dr. Rupa Matijadivada has the first question. Rupa, you want to state the question yourself?
Sure. Firstly, thank you both of you for the wonderful presentation. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we cannot see you, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly ask if on slide 31, if the prediction forecasts were based on business as usual clearing, or are they also based on the effect of the flexibility auction?
Let me. This one?
Yeah.
And the question was if the energy awards have considered the flexibility auction.
I think
Right.
you have it in the chat, Elina, if you look.
Oh. I presume the imbalance forecast. Oh, correct. So essentially, what we have been showing here as imbalances are differences between the 99 percentile in the upward direction and the median, and the median and the first percentile. So essentially, this visual representation we have for the imbalance assumes a day-ahead energy schedule that is at the median. So it's for most of our simulations, both the business as usual case and the flexibility auction end up scheduling day ahead, something that is close to the median. Sometimes it's the median, sometimes it's very close to the median. Does this make sense?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the effect of the flexibility auctions is indirectly accounted for, right? In this case, when you do the prediction for the next day.
So the effect of the flexibility auction, the way to see it from this graph is imagine that the business as usual case sees only the median. So the business as usual case is myopic. It sees only the y=0 axis. But the flexibility auction actually is more proactive, and it has information to the entire range of outcomes that can happen in real time. So the flexibility auction sees the purple shaded area, and the flexibility auction schedules units in day ahead, not only to provide day ahead energy, but also to procure flexibility that would allow us to go in the upward or in the downward direction for the purple shaded area, accounting for the expected cost of deploying that flexibility. We don't have here we have a lot of results for both sets of simulations that we don't have them included in this slide, where you would see actually how the day ahead energy schedules might be different, and more interestingly, which units are being committed in terms of technology type to provide this flexibility. And the idea of the box is to provide a comparison between the costs. So at the end of the day, the box would start having dollar amounts, but we want this data set to be revised before reporting dollar amounts.
Great, thank you. I think very quick question. I think Dan will coordinate that, but several people are asking if the slides will be made available in video. We try to get them, but maybe we can coordinate that with Dan later. Just related question for both of you, Robin and for Elina, is I know I had these infinite discussions at FERC about anything is market power that it's not marginal cost bid, right? That was the rule of the land, that you're exercising market power if you internalize anything. Now we are talking about completely different game, and you might have seen the idea that I've been promoting for a long time now, and Rupa and other people have done simulations on what we call dynamic monitoring decision systems, in which the bidders internalize whatever they they want to start up physical constraints and then just bid almost, implementable bid unless there is act of God, right? And I made many presentations at PERC along those lines, and it looks like we are moving in that direction now, like demand bid in. I just talked with Dick O'Neill yesterday. PERC is promoting bid in demand, which is exactly the same thing. You have to bid what is expected, you want to shave your load and so forth, manage uncertainties by internalizing things. Can you comment on how much of the market rule modifications will these all require, and is anybody going to let us do this? We have the same problem, that's why I'm asking. What is market power? A lot of economists, I still haven't seen one single paper written for power markets, sort of very clear definition of market power that Potomac and people are monitoring market power, but I think we are walking very shaky ground here of when is the bidder or market participant exercising market power, when are they internalizing something they really should internalize. So can you comment on that, or we can take it offline, but I really would like to have that discussion, because even in our own Perform project, we have two different approaches to this.
Well, I think one thing is that on our list of next steps, market monitoring is on that list. We showed you a very abbreviated one.
Okay,
but,
okay, I'll follow up with you guys, so we don't have to do now.
I guess a brief comment is that the real-time strike price, the strike price is essentially an expectation about the price at which the suppliers of flexibility options will be able to go up and down. So this is essentially an expectation of the cost at which you would be able to provide the flexibility. And we have started thinking about it in the traditional way. So today, market monitors, they are basically looking at the gas prices, and they allow for a safety margin. I think it's about 10%. And if the variable costs are more than 10% of the heat rate they know for the unit time the gas price, then they think that this might be a case worth investigating further because of market power. So this is conversations we're having. Is there a way to be able to verify the strike price? And is there a way to be able to do some sort of tests on how reasonable this strike price the flexibility providers submit is? So it's definitely something we are considering. Other market monitor tests that probably will have to be included would be market power tests like the one that ISOs do today when there is a congestion pocket. They are always monitoring these areas more closely to see if actually when there is congestion, certain pivotal suppliers have an incentive to increase the cost they submit. So these are the locational market power mitigation tests. I know California ISO does them before they even run the Dayahead market. So they have all the bids there, they look for pockets, and if in a pocket where there is congestion and supplier seems to be higher than 10% of the default energy bid, they can mitigate back their price.
But okay, but that is all I think we need as a community. We probably need a little more rigorous approach to defining market power, in particular when we deal uncertainties. I think we are almost running out of time, but for people who want to stay a few more minutes, we have a question. Elena and Robin, can you do a few more minutes?
I can do. I know Robin is
it won't take very long, but I think we have a couple of more questions from Nirmal. Nirmal, would you like to ask your question? It says, can the aggregators participate in the real-time ancillary service markets in the US? What does the regulatory framework look like?
I need to go to a meeting, but I'll probably see you again.
Yeah, we already asked, yeah. So can somebody comment on that?
Yeah, I think there are certain tests for sure, like PJM has published results from tests where aggregators of water heaters are able to follow the regulation signal. Also, there is a lot of discussion ongoing with FERC Order 222 on how aggregators can participate in all markets and all products that ISOs are helping facilitating trade for. And there are a lot of interesting questions with respect to aggregators that have to do also with metering capabilities, because usually the system operator wanted to be able to verify what is happening at every single unit that provides services. And now when we're talking about aggregators of many small resources, there are a lot of questions of do you actually need to meter the output at every single water heater, or like should we rely on statistical estimation? And I think there are many framework changes that are coming, and all the ISOs have submitted filings for FERC Order 222. I have gone through some, but not all. So I think it's an exciting space to be, and we will certainly have more to talk
Great,
about.
Elina. Odon, you want to ask your question and comment? Odon?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I've been listening intermittently, so you may have covered this, but I was curious about your proposed solution. How does that kind of compare to the existing markets that are trying to address the same thing in a more deterministic manner?
Thanks for the question. And that's a question we usually get. We are proposing to co-optimize these flexibility options with the Dayahead electricity markets. And the difference is that buyers of flexibility options can basically communicate their needs for hedging and their willingness to pay. So it's not the ISO that sets the requirements to manage this risk, but it's also the buyers of the flexibility options. So these are two basic differences with respect to the two basic differences that the buyers of the flexibility options submit their need and their willingness to pay. And there is also a clear scheme of who pays for this flexibility, and it's not a post-processing cost allocation for a reserve product.
Ex ante, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a major difference. So I think, unfortunately, we are running out of time. So there is one question left that we cannot address in real time. But I wanted to just close by making a comment, which is coming out of all these questions, that it's no longer just market for energy where everything is deterministic. So asymmetry of information, the same way as any other markets, when on the Wall Street and people make money or lose money, I think is going to become the sort of order of the day. So it is our responsibility to differentiate, I think, between these different proposals, who has what information, what should be the protocol for information exchange, what is the minimal information, and how that all clears. Is it ex ante or ex post, and so forth. So put it a little bit more at the more abstract level. What are the fundamental implications of the proposal? Because there is one proposal coming from RIHA, another proposal from NREL, EPRI, and so forth. I think the implications of these uncertainties and the rules on people's financial outcomes or technical outcomes are huge. So this is a very interesting program, this Perform, and thank you very much for sharing what you have done so far. We look forward to following up in the future. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.